Good morning, everybody. We will start the webinar in just a second. I still see a few people jumping online right now.
On my end, it says it's still on hold. You want me to go ahead and push the button on my end and see if it does anything?
Yes.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give just about 30 more seconds to see if anybody else is going to join us, and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. It's 9:01, so we have a lot to discuss today, so I want to make sure we make good use of our time. So good morning. This is the Mobility Mentoring Agency Coordinator webinar for January. And I'm Carrie Beamer. I'm a pre-K specialist with Dell. I'm working with you guys this year on this project. Also on the phone, we have Karen Gans, the Program Collaboration and Operations Manager. We have Jess Robertson, who's also a pre-K specialist, and we're really excited to have Nikki Ruiz here from Empath to talk to us about coaching as a parallel process. And Nikki says it's warming up in Boston today, so it was a brisk, what did you tell me, 20 degrees today? And that's a huge warm up for Nikki. So we're glad she could be on the call with us today. We are recording this webinar, and you guys are all muted right now. So don't forget that as we move through this webinar, we really like conversation from you guys or questions. So you can always click to raise your hand and Jess will unmute you. Or if you have a question directly, you can type it into the box and we'll make sure we read that. So without any further ado, here's our agenda today. So Nikki's going to talk to us this morning about coaching as a parallel process. And that'll take up probably the majority of our time. Then we're going to talk a little bit about ELMS. We have some questions directly for you guys that we want to address and get your input on as we look at building ELMS out further next year. And then we always have our standing topics that we want to cover. So hopefully, given the time, we can talk about SMART goals, executive functioning, and some poverty competency. So I'm at the point, is there a question, Jess? Do I see somebody raising their hand?
Yeah, you do. It looks like Estelle's hand has been marked. I was going to double check and make sure that to confirm that she did have something to say last time. Her computer was being kind of fun and putting her hand up even if she wasn't. So I just want to double check real quick.
Okay. So Nikki, this is the tricky place where I'm going to change presenters to you, and let's hope that I can do this. So yes, I'm passing it to you.
Great. So I will show my
it worked.
Screen. Great. And so sorry, just a quick question before I get started. If I should plan to wrap up around 10 a.m. Does that work?
That's perfect.
To give you guys enough time to do all the rest of the stuff that you want to do?
That would be perfect.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. And I also wanted to say that I can't see any of the other folks, and so I can't see if somebody raises their hand. So if one of you all could just let me know if people are raising their hands, and I will stop talking and allow them to speak. I just can't see it myself. So just please interrupt me if people have questions.
Yeah, Nikki, I'll be happy to jump in and do that.
Great. Great. So our topic today is supervision, coaching as a parallel process. And this is something that we have done a lot of thinking about at Empath, thinking about basically, how do we support our direct service staff to do the very best jobs that they can do and to be the best coaches that they can be for their families. The way to do that, we have decided, is through what we call a parallel process of, coaching our staff in the way that we hope that they will coach families. And before we get started, I'm wondering, because you all are coming from an early childhood background, a lot of you, and something that's very common in the early childhood field is something called a reflective supervision practice. Is that something that folks are pretty familiar with? Is this currently what your practice is, or are you? I'm just interested in getting a feel for what is the current supervision practice at Dell. And I don't know if folks maybe need to be unmuted in order to answer, but.
They typically do, and I know that this is Carrie. In the beginning, I have folks that are kind of shy, and it takes them a minute to answer. But is there somebody out there that wants to talk about reflective supervision and how you guys are handling that at your agencies? Just raise your hand, and Jeff will unmute you.
Looks like Katrina Alderman has something she wants to say. So Katrina, go ahead, you're unmuted.
Okay, I was just going to mention that for our agency, our supervisory staff have been going through reflective supervision training and then have been utilizing that training to start working with our staff and utilizing that. So we're still kind of fairly new at it, but we are using it pretty regularly throughout our agency and also included in this pilot.
Great. That's great to hear. Thank you. Is there anybody else that is interested in sharing, or? Maybe not. Okay.
Hey, Nikki, this is Karen. Karen, and one of the contractors who's not on the call, actually a couple of contractors that aren't on the call today, really have implemented something similar to what Katrina just talked about, where they've hired an outside trainer, and the trainer has come and provided training on reflective supervision, and then they've implemented it into their ongoing training and practices, like job embedded professional learning, that kind of, or a professional learning community.
Yep. Okay. That's great. That's great. Thank you. So, yeah, I'll just say that, I know that reflective supervision is a common thing in the early childhood field, and that is a great kind of foundation for folks. And what I'm going to be talking about today, a lot of it has some real overlaps with reflective supervision. It's just getting a bit more concrete about what reflective supervision looks like in mobility mentoring programs, and what are the specific things that we look out for and that we really try to do with staff. So that's kind of just a little bit of grounding. And so one of the ways that, it's really grounded in mobility mentoring is that we know coaching is one of the 4 essential elements of mobility mentoring, along with the bridge, goal setting, outcomes measurement, and incentives. And so it's really one of our 4, main components of mobility mentoring. It's what we make sure to train direct service staff on. We make sure that they are ready to do coaching with their families. And so some core beliefs of ours, when we're approaching the supervisory practice, are listed here. So the first one is just good coaches are made, not born. So, some people have more innate coaching capability than others, but really it's something that we can all really improve on. And, staff really need to be developed in order to be really great coaches. The second one is that staff need to be coached in order to learn how to be good coaches. So, you can't just send somebody to a quick training program. We can't, come in from Empath for a 2-day training and tell people how to be good coaches, and then they're just going to, learn it instantaneously. Staff need the relationship with a supervisor over time, being coached in order to really learn how to be a good coach themselves. And then some other ones that are just a little bit, kind of broader are, we kind of believe that everybody wants to be good at their job. Direct service staff, they're not in it for the money. They really want to help families. They really want to be doing the best that they can for their families. And so, when we approach what are sometimes problematic issues, some issues that they have with the work that they're doing with families, or, things that we want them to improve, we come at it from a perspective that we hope that they want to, improve as well. That just helps, in terms of the perspective that we're bringing to it. But, the important thing to remember is that stress, confusion, and ego can really get in the way. And so coaching is a really great way of dealing with these things. And, when we do the Mobility Mentoring Essentials training, we do talk a lot about the impacts of stress on families and on the individuals that we work with. But we have to remember that stress impacts not just the families we work with, but the staff as well. So thinking about our staff, is their work stressful? And so I have some, examples of stresses that our staff might encounter, different funders' expectations, new deadlines, data entry, their participants being in crisis, their high caseloads. A lot of them are getting some secondary or vicarious trauma in their work, hearing a lot about the trauma of others. And so we have to remember that our staff are leading stressful lives. And, these are just their work stresses. They may have home stresses that are in addition to these things. And stress really does impact our staff in just the same way that it impacts our participants. And so we're going to talk in a second about the executive functioning challenges and the challenges to sense of self. But just keeping in mind that staff can really become overwhelmed and stressed, which then can lead them to having some trouble solving problems, juggling priorities, and managing their time. And so our role as supervisors is to sort of create an environment where they can use their executive functioning and to help them and support them in growing their executive functioning skills. Sometimes we have to be like that scaffold for them for their executive functioning. So this is just kind of what I talked about before, a little bit of why do we use coaching in our supervision. It's because, we can't hope that staff would learn how to be good coaches in, a 2-day training or something like that. It really is that back and forth relationship that is going to be how the growth occurs. So here is our statement on executive functioning that folks should be maybe familiar with from the Mobility Mentoring Essentials training. This is from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. And it just says, being able to focus, hold, and work with information in mind, filter distractions, and switch gears is like having an air traffic control system at a busy airport to manage the arrivals and departures of dozens of planes on multiple runways. And so this is the metaphor of, our executive functioning is dealing with all those, different planes and different runways of, all that our staff has to juggle in their day-to-day lives. And then the other kind of important piece of it, of, the way that stress and the difficulties of the job really impact our staff is in the sense of self. And the sense of self encompasses all of these different aspects of aspirations, social norms, stereotypes, identity, self-esteem, agency, motivation. basically, people's ideas of who they are in the world, what they can accomplish, and things like that. And so, stress can really impact people's sense of self very much, because if we don't feel like we're good at our work, or if we're having difficulties in our work, that's such a strong piece of our identity, who we are as people. And so we have to remember, for our staff, how can we continue to bolster their sense of self even when they're having difficulties? And so kind of an example of this would be, how do we provide support to our staff in a way that is, being respectful of their own agency and keeping in mind their own self-esteem, right? So if we have a staff person that, made some mistake, we don't want to be berating them or, telling them what a terrible job that they did, because that would be damaging, right, to their sense of agency and their sense of self-esteem, in addition to just being not a very nice way to treat people. But because the sense of self is so necessary, having a strong sense of self is so necessary for people to be able to do good work, we want to be mindful of that as well. So the core values that we bring to the coaching relationship with our staff are the same ones that we bring to the coaching relationship with participants. So starting with, recognizing the innate value of the person being coached, recognizing that they can be creative and resourceful, trying to dig out, and understand the ways that the person is already creative and resourceful, and getting them to kind of, work on that. Really keeping in mind the fact that we can all learn and grow. And finally, maintaining unconditional positive regard, right? So no matter what the person does, maintaining respect for them as a human being, and, not getting kind of tripped up in, what happened today. So those are kind of our values that we bring for our staff. And then in terms of the coaching relationship, we, again, there are a lot of parallels to the coaching relationship with participants. Obviously, the main difference is that as a supervisor, you do have, the power to fire somebody, right? And that is kind of a major difference in the relationship. Although, for program participants, we do have the ability to, exit them from programs if they're not, kind of keeping up with the expectations. So they're, but I recognize it is a little bit different. But you can kind of keep a lot of the same kind of perspectives on the relationship as we do with participants, in terms of, first of all, kind of thinking about it as a team approach rather than a power dynamic. So what I mean by that is, it can be very easy in a supervisory relationship to take a more authoritative role and say, okay, I'm the boss, I'm telling you, you need to do this, so you need to do this. And a coaching approach would say, okay, we have shared goals. We want the best. We both want what's best for the family. We both want, for their success and the success of the child. And so let's think together about how we can make sure that that's going to happen moving forward. And so it's a much more, it's an approach that really engages people, right? Rather than disengaging them. And so that, again, is kind of going back to the whole agency thing, making sure that people feel like they have the power, or some of the power in the relationship as well. The second piece of the relationship is that we want to support autonomy, right? Helping staff to recognize the power within themselves, because our goal is to work with staff to a point where they no longer need us. Nobody wants to be a micromanager. And micromanaging doesn't work well for anybody. It doesn't work well for the staff person because they feel disempowered. They feel, like they're being, somebody's breathing down their neck. They don't like to work that way. And it doesn't work well for supervisors either, because it's actually a lot of work to be a micromanager. And it's really much better if we can just trust that staff have the, ability to do what they need to do, that they, have the capacity to solve the problems themselves. And of course, they still need to kind of check in with us from time to time, but we really want staff to get to a place where they don't really need us as much. because then that's going to free us as supervisors up to do, much more exciting work rather than just, micromanaging. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm getting over a little cough, so excuse me if I have to do that from time to time. The next piece is co-investment, right? And so just like we talk about co-investment with participants in terms of, not chasing the ones that aren't ready to engage yet, not doing the work for them, we want to make sure that, the same is true of our staff, that for staff that aren't, doing things, that we're not starting to take on their work, because we want to have really good boundaries, right? We want to make it very clear, what's expected, what's their job, as opposed to what's our job. We want to model for them, appropriate interpersonal professional boundaries. And then the other piece of the boundaries kind of conversation that I'd like to mention is just that we also are their role models for work-life boundaries. And so if you are a person who's sending them emails at 3 o'clock in the morning, or are, working on weekends and things like that, staff are going to see that, and they're going to expect that that's what is expected of them. And so if we want staff to learn how to take care of themselves and have some kind of work-life boundaries, that is something that we do need to model for them. So the coaching values and the coaching relationship, the kind of perspective that we bring to the supervisory relationship in a mobility mentoring program, it really sets the foundation for us to do the coaching process in the same kind of similar way to the coaching process that mobility mentors do with their participants. Here at MPATH, we have simplified the coaching process into these 5 core coaching competencies. Sorry, that's a little bit of a tongue twister, which I'll go through now. But basically, we have, it's kind of a cycle. It starts with self-assessment and goal setting, moves on to aspiration, motivation, and momentum, then on to problem solving, strategizing, and providing expertise, then on to goal setting, or goals orientation, and finally accountability and follow-up. So this is kind of the same sort of cycle that we talk about going through with participants. Oops. There we go. And so for each of these, I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, on the left, you'll just be able to read what does it look like in direct service staff. So how would we apply this principle with direct service staff, how they apply it to their participants. And then what does it look like in the supervisory relationship? And so and this is what we refer to as a parallel process. Each of the things in the left-hand column has a parallel in the right. And so it's how do we work in the same way with staff? So this first one, self-assessment and goal setting, obviously with participants, it's using the bridge, setting goals. But a supervisory relationship should also really start off with self-assessment. And so really engaging staff in their own self-assessment, so getting them thinking about on kind of a broad scale, what are their strengths, how would they like to grow? And then also in any situation that you're debriefing with them, having them first self-assess, how did that go for you? That's one of my favorite questions, to ask staff, when they're telling me about, difficult conversation that they had, or a difficult participant that they're working with, is, just helping them to do some kind of self-reflection first off, and thinking for themselves about how it went. Because we don't want to start from a place that it feels like we are the ones passing judgment on them. Because again, going back to that whole sense of self thing, making sure that we are maintaining their, their sense of self-worth and things like that. And so by getting them to engage in their own self-assessment, they're really the ones that are kind of putting the stake in the ground and saying, okay, this didn't go well for me, I really want to change it. And that really helps with motivation, rather than, a supervisor just saying, oh, you need to change. And so, you know, the next step is really engaging them in goal setting, both short and longer term, so they can really feel like they're working towards something. And so goal setting can be as small as, you know, debriefing with somebody, you know, talking about what happened with a participant that they're having difficulty with. And a question I like to ask them is, okay, so what's your plan for the next meeting? Or, you know, what do you think you'll do next? Because that's a way of engaging them in some very kind of short-term goal planning for themselves around, okay, you know, what am I going to do differently next time? Because, you know, for staff, it's very easy for them to fall into these kind of patterns with certain participants where, you know, they're kind of getting tripped up in the same way each time. And so really getting them to think about how they can work differently moving forward can be really helpful. And then, of course, on a kind of grander scale, anytime that you're doing like, you know, performance reviews or anything like that, making sure that they're engaged in their own goal setting in a longer term fashion. You know, what kind of outcomes do they want to be seeing for their participants? What is it that they're trying to work towards? Because it's really important to have that kind of future orientation so people can feel like they have some kind of meaning in the work that they're doing. And then on the kind of biggest level, making sure that staff understand organizational goals is another important piece of this, and understanding sort of what role they play in the organizational goals. And so I'm wondering, you know, from the Dell perspective, what are some of the big like organizational goals that that Dell has that you can think that, you know, you might want to involve staff in understanding a little bit better, because they're in some way kind of integral to those goals? Are there any that folks can think of? And I can give you an example if it's helpful. So at Empath, we set a target around the percentage of participants who are going to see an increase in income. Because for Empath, you know, we are a mobility mentoring organization. We say that we get people out of poverty. And so, you know, in order to get people out of poverty, we need to be seeing income gains. And so we set a target around, you know, X% of families this year will increase their income. And that's something that we set organizationally. But then for every staff person, we have to help them understand, okay, you know, this was what was decided at the organizational level. You know, how are you personally going to be working to get us there, to get us to that number? So that's one example. But are there examples at Dell that folks can think of for that?
Hey, this is Karen, and I just want to let everyone know that when Nikki's saying Dell, she really means you all. She means you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And what you're implementing. It's just a slight wording that could cause some confusion. So I know some of you are doing this out there, so please raise your hand so we can unmute you so you can share about what it is that you're doing.
Yes, at your program. Yes, I'm sorry, I should have said that. Sorry.
No worries. It's totally understandable.
Looks like Katrina has something to say, so go ahead, Katrina, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I was making some assumptions about that, but I was glad that there was clarification. But I do think your example really resonated with me, because thinking about not just looking at, I mean, I think our agency goal oftentimes has been, you know, for staff to be able to get their 3 visits in, and for families to be identifying the SMART goal, and for staff to, you know, have improvements around helping families, you know, make some of those goals more into the meet the SMART goal definition type of thing. But the example that you gave about something that our program might specifically be wanting to look at those outcomes, I hadn't thought about it in that way, and so that's very helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I'm glad that was helpful. Great. Anybody else have anything they want to share about that?
Okay, come on, everybody. I start calling on people. You know I'll do it. Oh, good job, Mary. Thank you.
All right, Mary, go ahead.
Karen, can you hear me? Yeah, nothing like a little pressure there. No, really, just trying to formulate as I'm hearing this. I think right now, kind of to piggyback a little bit on what Katrina was saying, we've had kind of a different way of how we've done business, and so now we're starting to kind of think about this in some different ways. And the thought that comes to my mind more is that as we are finding what families are identifying as their needs, we are seeing themes that lead us to realize that kind of as a larger program, we need to find more resources. So as an example, you know, helping families with financial literacy, or families that maybe aren't. Another example might be that, you know, just that constant tension around families being engaged in their child's, well, more than just dropping their kids off at preschool. So really being engaged and seeing the value in their parallel process with their kids. So getting them to come to parent education trainings. And so for us, I think right now, I would just kind of circle back around and say, the data that we're getting is helping us to maybe start to get where we think organizationally about what some of our goals would be, and then how can we support back out resources to support families, you know, basically using their data to help us.
Yes, absolutely. You are right on target there. I love hearing that you are integrating what you've heard from families and thinking about how you might need to adjust practice in order to better serve their needs. And those are conversations that I would encourage you to engage staff in, right? Because staff are hearing a lot of this stuff directly from participants. And, you know, they have a lot of insight into, you know, what the participants are actually going through and what they actually need. And then they can be part of this goal setting process, right? And they can be part of the programmatic goal setting process of saying, okay, you know, what ways do we want to shift practice? What are the things we want to highlight or especially work on in the coming year? What's really important? You know, all of these things. And then they'll have much more buy-in, right, to actually accomplishing the goals once they've been a part of the goal setting process. And that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that nobody wants to be told, you know, that they have to work on something. And it's going to be much more exciting and motivating for staff when they've been a part of the process. So I'm really happy to hear that. Anything else folks want to mention for the program goals?
Mary just wanted to follow up and say, yes, so true.
Great. Great. So I'll move along to the next core coaching competency, which is aspiration, motivation, and momentum. And so for our direct service staff, this is really the great way that they each help participants to really believe in themselves and see brighter futures for themselves, and reflect on their values and feed into their values, and then create momentum, right? All these really great things that we know that our direct service staff are so good at doing. And I would, you know, ask you to reflect on, you know, how much are you doing that yourself for your staff? You know, sometimes we can get really caught up in the day-to-day of really needing to say, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and we don't take the time to help staff to both, you know, recognize the positives that have happened and celebrate those, and also, you know, think in a bigger picture way about their own lives. And so what this core coaching competency really means in a supervisory relationship is really believing in staff, right? And helping them to see their own future, understanding for each of your staff people, what do they really want to do? You know, what is it that got them into this work? and what do they ultimately want to do with it? How would they like to progress? What would they like to see in their own lives? For some of our staff who, you know, have maybe done this a long time and they just want to keep doing it, that's great. But how can we, you know, support them in continuing to grow within the same position? And then for some of our staff, you know, maybe they're interested in going back to school to, pursue degrees and things like that, or maybe they're interested in a supervisory role eventually, or maybe they're interested in a different aspect of the work, advocacy or something like that. Getting to know what makes the staff people tick and what they really want for their own lives can help them. It can help you to figure out how to make the work more meaningful for them and get them really excited about taking on new things. And I think that's really important because we know, you know, there's so much burnout in this field. In any helping relationships, there can be a lot of burnout. And so this can be something that can really combat burnout, is just helping people to think about, you know, their own bigger picture and their own future, what they really want to be doing and how, you know, what they're doing today might help them, you know, further on down. And then the other part to that is just understanding staff's own values, goals, motivations, and tying that into programmatic or organizational goals. And so, you know, understanding like why folks do this work. You know, what is it that brought them here, keeps them here? And, you know, for a lot of our staff, it's just, I really want to, help the participants that I'm working. I really care about the families. I really care about the kids, you know, whatever it is, making sure that you're using their own motivations, not assuming that, you know, their motivations are the same as ours, but using their own motivations and tying these into the program or organizational goals. So an example of how I would do that here at Empath is, you know, to go back to that example before of the, you know, the organization having a certain target set for income increases, you know, really talking about with the staff person, not, oh, you have to do this because it's a organization goal and, you know, you just have to, but saying, you know, I know that you really care so much about your participants and you really, want them to be successful in life and things. And, you know, a really big part of that is, having a job and increasing their income over time. And so, you know, how are you providing the support to them to help them to do that? And so just, figuring out ways to phrase, what you're talking about in terms of, you know, them continuing to grow in their own practice, phrasing it from their own motivations rather than, you know, just purely, you know, because I said so, you have to do it. And that obviously is going to keep people engaged for much longer. And then finally, the other aspect to this is really creating momentum by highlighting the positive. And here at Empath, we call this, focusing on glimmers and celebrating glimmers. And so a glimmer is anything, you know, any little light or spark that comes up that is a positive and, it doesn't have to be a full-fledged outcome. I mean, obviously the whole, X% of people are going to increase their income that's an outcome and we can celebrate outcomes. But a glimmer might be, oh, this family that you work with, mom just got a job. That's great, and really celebrating those things and helping people to remember those and celebrate those as teams. At the beginning of each of our team meetings, we actually have time to share glimmers. And so this is a time where people, our direct service staff can just, shout out whatever little successes that they've had recently. And so it might be, so-and-so got her kid's IEP figured out, so-and-so started a new education program at school, up to really big things. Sometimes we'll have really, grand accomplishments of, graduations or, purchasing new homes or something like that. That's like a really big celebration, but even just little glimmers should be celebrated. Even I would say, if a staff person has a participant who has not been, responsive to them, and they finally get a meeting with them and sit down and do, everything that they had intended to do with that person, I would call that a glimmer. That's something to be celebrated because, that took a lot of work. And helping staff to keep in mind all the good work that they're doing is just really motivating, and will encourage them to kind of take the next step and do more. So I want to open it up now and ask folks just about, are there ways currently that you're doing any of this, or are there ways that you think you could, within your own program context, start to do some of this aspiration, motivation, and momentum stuff? No? Okay.
Go ahead, Mary.
Well,
Mary's about to say something. Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, good. Okay.
Have some time during our in-services where we break into some professional learning communities and we talk about some problems of practice and try and staff, in a confidential manner. We're a very rural community, and so our staff are basically out there without a lot of support. So anyway, do some problems of practice conversations. We really, I like the idea of being intentional about seeking out glimmers. And I think that we come around to the successes, but I really like the intentionality of it, and I'm going to start using it. Thanks.
Oh, good. Great. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, the thing is that in a supervisory relationship, so much of your time together, with reason, has to be focused on the negative, right? What's not going well? Where are you getting stuck? Who haven't you been able to meet with? Who's not attaining their goals? Who's in chaos? Because those things have to be focused on. And that's fine. I'm not saying that you shouldn't also focus on those things, because that's part of getting the work done, is, focusing on problems and figuring out how to solve them together. But, if we're interested in, strengthening people's own sense of self-worth and their agency, we're going to do that by focusing on the positive and reminding them of the positive. So I think it's just, it's definitely important to do both.
Looks like Estelle also had something she wanted to say. Go ahead, Estelle.
Oh, can everyone hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, we do meet as staff, as FSS staff on a regular basis, and at each one of those meetings, we try to either start or end with some things that are happening in the field that they've been encouraged by, or that they've seen families grow in, and just try to share some positive things that are happening with the families that they're working with, without naming names, of course. But we try to either start or end that way at most all of our meetings.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So this is something you're already doing.
Yes.
Great. Great. Anybody else want to share? Okay, moving right along then. So the third core coaching competency is problem solving, and so this involves strategizing and providing expertise. And so for direct service staff, we talk about them taking time to explore different options and alternatives with participants before they jump in and just solve people's problems for them, and then offering their own expertise only when participants ask for it. And so, not kind of jumping right into, I think this is something that is very typical, very human nature, is when we hear about a problem, we want to solve it. We want to just jump right in and tell them. And, if you think about relationships that you have either with friends or family, I mean, that is, what we tend to do as human beings. But when we're setting up a coaching relationship with somebody where we're really trying to help them to develop their own skills, it's not going to help them in the long term if every problem that they have, we just solve it for them. That's not going to, you know, build their potential later on to solve their own problems. What's going to help them solve their own problems later on is having the space and having somebody to talk to sort the problem out on their own. And so what we can do as supervisors is helping staff to explore options and alternatives. So when they come to you with a difficult participant that they've been working with, a difficult situation, asking them questions about, okay, so, you know, what have you tried? What are some options that you can think of? How might you would do things differently next time? So just asking them lots of questions to explore, you know, what else could work? You know, asking about their own past experience. So, you know, have you ever experienced something like this before? Was there anything that worked for you in the past? You know, those are good questions to be asking. And then after you've done some exploring with them, offering expertise, you know, your own expertise, because obviously as a supervisor, you have, you know, you do have some expertise. You have probably seen some of the same things over and over. But doing it only after you've done that work of exploring with the staff person. And so, you know, something that I'll oftentimes ask my supervisees is something like, you know, I've worked with other folks who have had this problem before. You know, would you be interested in hearing like what helped for them? And so just the same way that we do with our participants, you know, not just kind of overloading them with information, but only kind of sharing that expertise after doing the strategizing work, we've found to be more helpful for staff. But hopefully, you know, the work that you can do with the staff person in supervision can really be, you know, oftentimes they'll solve their own problems. Oftentimes they know what they need to do, honestly, because they know their situation better than anybody else. They know the families that they're working with better than you do. And so oftentimes they already know how to, you know, attack whatever problem it is that they have. They just need space to kind of sort through all of the, you know, all of the competing demands, you know, to go back to our executive functioning analogy. They have lots of different planes landing on lots of different runways, and they just need a little help in, you know, having some space to sort it all out. So that's kind of what we can do for our staff. And then the other major part of it is to maintain a goals orientation. And so a lot of times, you know, supervision can be derailed by whatever the kind of crisis of the day is, because, you know, participants have crises every day. And these, you know, feed into the staff person feeling like they're kind of in crisis. And so what we can do in a supervisory relationship is helping staff to stay focused on the big picture. And so, you know, reminding them of, you know, what their job is. Sometimes, I mean, honestly, pretty frequently I have to tell my staff, like, that's actually not your job. You know, like, big picture, like, I recognize that what you're worried about is a big concern, but that's not actually like something that you have control over. You know, if somebody is, you know, talking about, I don't know, they have all sorts of different crises that come up in terms of, you know, somebody having a fight with a landlord, or, you know, an issue that comes up at work for them, or things like that. I mean, there's just so much of the crisis that comes up in our participants' lives that our staff actually, there's not really much that they can honestly do about it. I mean, they can be a support for the participants, and they can help them to strategize, but it's not their responsibility to really do anything about it. And so I think we have to sometimes remind our staff to kind of stay focused on what they do have control over, and kind of remember the big picture of, okay, you're here to help families in these specific ways. This is your kind of almost going back to the job description, and helping them to kind of remember that. We really want to respond instead of react to crises. And what I mean by that is, you know, when a staff person comes to you with something that feels like a crisis, you know, being a little bit more methodical in your approach to it, helping them to think through, you know, is this really something that we need to be responding to right now? If it is, how can we make a plan so that something like this doesn't happen in the future? Being a little bit more methodical rather than just jumping right into like, oh, I need to solve this problem immediately. And then, finally, like I was kind of mentioning before, redirecting staff back to their work and their goals when crisis does arise. And so, if something comes up for them, kind of reminding them, these are the goals that we have, and how is this crisis impacting the goals that you have, and let's like refocus on that. And so I'm going to share with you, as we always do at Empath when talking about goals, just remind you of the green edge of the wedge. Just like we want our participants to be on the green edge of the wedge, we also really want our staff to be on the green edge of the wedge. We know that they have limited time, bandwidth. If they're spending most of their time focused on crisis management, they are not thinking about goals attainment. And so that is going to directly filter down to the families that they work with. And so we as supervisors really need to hold the frame for them and remind them that their true job is really to be focused on the goals attainment, and to, really bring them back to that, which is obviously difficult to do. Obviously, there are some crises that come up that, you do as staff have to deal with. Obviously, if there's anything concerning the safety and well-being of a child, obviously you do have to deal with those kind of things more immediately. So I'm not saying, to not respond with swiftness when it's needed. Obviously you do need to do that, but there are, there are ways of helping staff to think through, is this really, we call them like a capital C crisis. Is this like really a crisis with a capital C, or is this really something that, is just the crisis of the day? Because every day there's going to be more and more. So I'm wondering if folks have any ways that they've thought about this crisis orientation stuff, or the goals orientation stuff, and ways that they have thought about this for their staff, or just things that have been difficult for you even. Maybe you haven't found the solution yet, but there's just something difficult that you want to just raise. And that's okay too, because I think this can be a space for you all to kind of talk to each other about this stuff.
Go ahead, Katrina.
Hi, I was just going to mention that, it was just helpful for me to hear that that's something that's not uncommon at Empath as well, because I know there are times that I'm finding myself, taking some time either in person, face-to-face, or over the phone with staff, kind of going back to, okay, and let's go back to what our role is. This is where our focus is. Absolutely, we can share that must be difficult with the family, but what is the piece that we can support in that, and what is the piece then that they continue on that path to, they've already reported it to law enforcement. We don't have a piece in this because it's not like regarding a child abuse or neglect thing. So kind of taking it back, and I think it is interesting how sometimes, because there's so much in that role, oftentimes of building that relationship with the family, is that sometimes for them it can get blurred. So for us as, support and supervisory staff, to be able to remind them to kind of go back to that main thing like they do for their families. So it was good. It was good that it was nice to hear that example. Yeah, great. I'm glad. Yeah, no, it's definitely, if you feel that way, you are definitely not alone. I think that any healthy relationship, because people care so much, they get into the work because they care so much. And, they sometimes don't have the best of boundaries with their families. And then, something that is truly, perhaps truly, kind of awful starts to happen to the family, and they get sucked right in. But the reality of it is that oftentimes there's very little that we can actually do about any of it, Yeah. And it's unfortunate, but. Yeah. One thing I have encouraged our staff to do is there's been times where in talking with them, I find, there's tends to be kind of on everybody's caseload a certain percentage that they have higher needs, or they're needing more support, and some of those that kind of are harder to engage. And so one of my suggestions oftentimes, because I was seeing some staff were scheduling those higher need families all in the same week. And granted, I mean, crises aren't usually scheduled, so that can't always happen that way. But in times when they're offering up times for families, I've said, it would be, in your best interest too, for your self-care, not to have all of those in 1 week. Try to spread them out a little bit. So then that way you're able to kind of rebuild your reserves after working with a family that takes a little bit more out of you.
That is a great practice. I'm glad that you shared that. That's a great idea. Yeah, and definitely not scheduling things back to back after those families, right? Because just knowing that you may be a little depleted after you get out of that visit, you want to make sure to have a little time, and definitely helping staff to just think through their own self-care is really important. It's not something that comes super naturally to a lot of people, especially people who really want to help. They tend to put a lot into their relationships and not really sort of think in an intentional way about how they're going to take care of themselves. So it's great that you help them to think about that. So
Mary has something that she wanted to add.
Oh, sure.
So
Sorry,
I have a question around this, and I appreciate that you asked us. I'm just really curious, and this might be just some opportunity for some further training for us around helping staff with harder to engage families, those in crisis. How do we help them just in that delicate step when you're in a visit with a family and the crises start coming forward, helping them in that balance of listening and then helping the family to kind of move. They're not going to necessarily move out of the crisis, but we only have a limited amount of time that we can, be with them and to kind of redirect back to the goals. So I just think this is a place where I know we could use more training. I could use more training to help my staff, and I know staff feel guilty about not staying in the crisis conversation. Yep.
I can touch on that a little bit this afternoon when we have the webinar with all of the staff. So I can definitely, because it does relate a lot to what I was going to talk about in terms of different EF challenges. But it's so related to like the EF challenges, because what you see in people in crisis is that they're going into like their fight or flight, and they've got their amygdala firing, and it's kind of overwhelming their ability to access their EF skills. And so the question is, how do you kind of bring people down from that? How do you get them back? Because once they've started going into that mode, it's very difficult to kind of bring them back and say, okay, but what about the budget that you said that you were going to create, or any of that stuff? You're not gonna. That doesn't make sense. And it can be, indeed, it could be very damaging to your relationship with them if you tried to do it that way. And staff definitely don't want that. And so we can talk about that a little bit this afternoon. And then if there's further training that you'd like on that, we could definitely think about that as well. Great. So we just have one more coaching competency, and we're almost out of time. So I want to just get to this last one, because it's a really important piece in terms of accountability and follow-up. And so in a supervisory relationship, this is really, almost more important than any of the other steps, because if you did all of the other steps, but you didn't do this one, nothing would happen. If you don't have accountability and follow-up in your relationship, then you can have the best coaching relationship in the world and still nothing will get done, because there's no accountability. And so one of the things that I really like to do is, let me first say, this looks like just checking in on goals with staff, making sure that you are up to date on what progress they've made, and then making a plan so that goals can be achieved if they haven't been already. And so kind of doing that, going back and strategizing again if it needs to happen. And one of the things that can really support in this is just setting up some different tools and supports for yourself. So I use my Outlook calendar a lot, or you can use whatever calendar you use. But I definitely schedule in reminders to myself to ask people about different goals that they have, or you know, following up with different families that they said that they would follow up with. I just put it right into my calendar so that it reminds me to touch back in with them. I also use supervision templates to kind of remind myself of what I'd like to cover with each person. So for example, I'm sure that data entry is an issue because it is everywhere. And so, you know, on my supervision template, I have, you know, a reminder to myself to kind of check in with them about the data entry. And, you know, some other things might be, you know, I want to check in with them about all of their families. I want to check in with them about any recent trainings we've had. So anyway, just thinking about, you know, what are the things that you want to make sure to check in on, and making sure that those are on some kind of a template. I don't know if you already do this, but, you know, we use dedicated notebooks or binders for each staff person with a tab in it for each participant. So you can just have all of the notes kind of together. That really helps with follow-up because you can see, like, for each participant, you know, what did you talk about last time and what did you say you were going to do this time? And that can really help. And then just using check boxes. So, you know, I have a section on my supervision template that says, you know, what needs to be followed up on. And then I can put, you know, little boxes that I then check off later for any follow-up that needs to happen. So I don't know if folks are already using these, but if you're not, you know, this can be just really helpful in terms of, yeah, closing the loop and making sure that people, that staff, you know, have some accountability built in. So with that being said, it is 10:01, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I don't know if there's time for questions, but I'd be happy to stay on for a couple more minutes, but I do want to be respectful in case you want to move on to what's next.
Yeah, for sure. We can take a few minutes if somebody has a burning question they want to ask Nikki. Or not even a burning question, just a question.
Just any question. Or comments, other things that have worked well for you in terms of tools and supports to help build in accountability, help you with follow-up.
Looks like Amy had a question. Amy, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and why don't you ask that in person. Go ahead, Amy. All right, I'll ask. Oh, she says she's not able to. So she asked, could you please share the supervision template that you use?
Oh, sure. Yep. I'll. Is it okay if I email it to Carrie and then she can forward it to everybody?
Yep, that's perfect.
Yeah, it's really simple. So don't. It's not like super fancy or anything. It's just literally a Word document with like a couple different reminders and space to take notes. But I will definitely share it. Great. Anything else? Okay.
All right.
Well, with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and hopefully it goes back to you. And yeah, it was a great pleasure, and I will talk with folks this afternoon on the call with the direct service staff. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Nikki, so much, and we're looking forward to listening to what you have to say this afternoon, too.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, so we are at the point where we want to talk a little bit about ELMS. So hopefully you guys, we can unmute you and have a conversation about this. And Karen and I have been meeting with the data team and looking at ways we can work on building out ELMS to better collect our data, to better serve you guys as far as pulling reports. And one of the things, the first thing that we came across was this question about, should we require a new assessment every year for returning children? So right now our data is really going from year to year, and we have you guys do another one because we understand that things may have changed over the summer, and it could be good practice to sit down with the family, check in again, even if it is a returning child. I can tell you that I feel like we're leaning towards doing a new assessment every year for those exact reasons, that things change even in a few months for families, so checking in and doing it again. But I'm curious to hear from you guys, is there some compelling reasons or some thoughts that you have about doing a new assessment or not doing a new assessment for returning kids? Who wants to go first on whether or not you think we should do this? And I know you guys have something to say, so tell us what you think.
So while you're thinking about that, this is Karen, and I can just say, we were thinking along the lines of teachers assessing children and how we wanted to, really Joyce talked with us about having it be new every year. It will be consistent in ELMS with the other yearly, health requirements and family support and ed requirements that are built into ELMS. And so we were thinking that it would be helpful consistency-wise also to just have there be a restart at the beginning of each year. And we really wanted to make sure that we heard from you that you all agree with that.
Looks like Estelle has a comment. Go ahead, Estelle.
So I do totally agree with it. I think that you're right on that every year families' lives change, but not only that, the family supports could change from year to year. So a family in our program, a family may not have the same family support the following year. Most of the time they do, but occasionally they don't. And those questions are just really good foundational questions for family support to get to know a family, and for the family, for just to open discussions and lay out the basics of what's important in life. And so I really think that the new assessment is important each year.
Great, thank you for those comments. Does Danielle want to talk too?
Go ahead, Danielle.
Hi. Yes, I think that's a great question, and hadn't really thought about that till you just proposed it. And I think if it's a returning family and returning child, we would have all of the assessment information from the previous year, that even during the first visit, just having a check-in with the family to see how things are going since the program had ended, and perhaps just continuing on with the goals and changing it if there's a new goal that they'd like to start. But I do agree that it would be aligned with the assessments we do for children. We just do one, and then we utilize TS Gold. So if we just did one for the family and then utilize the goal sheet, or if their family identifies any changes that have occurred that would impact their bridge, like moving up on any of the pillars.
So Danielle, are you saying in essence that we're saying the same thing, that even though it's a returning family, you're going to do an update to the assessment. It might go quicker because you have a lot of background information. You'll just be updating the new stuff, therefore putting in a new assessment based on last year's information.
Yes. If there was a way to just do an update instead of like rechecking all the boxes within ELM.
Yeah, so I think I don't know that that's going to be possible unless we make it that way. I think the way that Joyce was thinking that it would be set up is that it would be like any of the previous year's information that you access in ELMS, you go to the drop-down menu and you pick the year, and then you can see the information, the exchanges, the goals that families set in that year. And then I think the way that it would end up working the best in ELMS is that it would be a new, you do a fresh start. You could refer and you could pull that information in to inform the action plan at the beginning of the next year. Do I have that right, Carrie?
Absolutely. So it's year to year, but I'm thinking, you know, you're still going to have this sort of background information. You could even print off last year's sort of assessment, be with the family, and then, you know, you're sort of doing an update. But as far as like having then to go say it's 2019, the fall of 2019, you would have to enter all that in again, but it may not take you as long if there wasn't changes from year to year, if that makes sense to folks.
Looks like Danielle has another comment. Go ahead, Danielle.
Is there any way that they would not have to re-enter all that information that was already entered, that it just rolls over year after year, as it is very pertinent information? And it could be quite time consuming to re-enter past info.
So Danielle, it'd be great if you could get a list to Carrie of the things that you would really like staff not to have to duplicate, and then we can bring it to Joyce and we can see if that would be possible. If there could be some field that would automatically populate, and then it would just be the goal setting piece that would be new. I don't know that that's going to be possible though. I know you can, there are some pieces that are populated year to year in other fields in ELMS, and so we can see if that would be something that could be possible here too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody got a last comment on new assessment on returning kids before I ask?
I guess my question is kind of similar to the last comment, just about the level of time needed to do the data entry. Definitely, you know, it'll be easier because the easier, faster part of it will be that if you have a relationship with the family, it'll be easier to kind of engage and kind of assess where they are. The time part related to the data entry is not going to be easier and quicker. And you know, and my comment that I always kind of push out here is, are we continuing to look at, can we make the assessment shorter? Are there fewer questions that we are continuing to wonder, do we need as many as we have? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can speak to that last question, Mary, and that really was the process that everyone participated in last year when when Jerry came and you guys looked at the assessment and you looked to validate it and have it the shorter assessment. So we went from 21 questions to 17. That was what I thought was going to be happening in that process. And so the assessment is set for now. That's something that we could talk about in the future. And I don't know, I mean, I think that there'd have to be a work group that would come together. You know, there would be some pieces that we would have to make sure that we got some funding for. It would have to be revalidated, all of those pieces. So I think shortening it at this point is probably, to some degree, funding dependent.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. So on the assessments, should we require every single field to be marked with a number? Because what do we do if direct support staff leave it blank? And we've seen it be left blank, and a lot of folks, I know, I worked in the field for years. I may not have, within the time constraints of visiting with a family, been able to get to the level of that assessment. So the problem with leaving things blank is that it really skews our data. And we've kind of thought about some ways we could work around this. If you think about TS Gold, we require them to fill out every single, I'm mixing my terms now. What are they? The bands? But you have to do every single one. You can't leave it blank. So what are you guys' thoughts on assessment? And I know you've seen it before, that there have been fields that haven't been completed. And maybe while everyone's thinking about this, Karen, do you have anything to add about that?
No, this really is a concern that Joyce brought up when she was going through and looking at the data entry and wondering whether or not if we wanted to put, build some pieces into ELMS that did not allow staff to leave any fields blank. And of course, it's concerning to her because when there are blank fields, as the third bullet says, there end up being data concerns around the data that we're gathering when we have fields that are left blank. So do you think that would be something that would be supportive to staff as they're completing the assessment, to have a little prompt that reminds them that they still have something, they have a blank field? And you can just type your answer in the chat box or the question box. And just, we can record answers in there if people feel strongly one way or the other on the topic.
All right, it looks like we got from Mary, prompts would be great. And Amy said, I support the prompts and also really clear expectations for what needs to be completed by the deadline.
Yep, we'd probably try and build that like a little hover, like when you hover over it in ELMS, it could say something really clearly around what needs to happen in order for it to be completed.
And I would also just add that hopefully, if not the next time we meet, maybe the next time after that, Joyce has agreed to come on with us, agency coordinators, and then kind of walk you through some reports. And she even showed me a couple of things that I didn't know you could do that I know are going to be really helpful for you guys when you're looking through your staff to see who's completed, who still has assessments that need to be done. So look for that in the future as well.
The prompts would be great.
Okay. Keep your comments coming. I'm going to just move on to the next thing that I'm calling Name That Category. So we have talked forever about SMART goals. We talk about it every month. And as we started looking at SMART goals, and I'm starting to read what people are writing for their SMART goals, we noticed this trend, and that was, where are people actually categorizing those SMART goals? So I'm going to give you an example of a goal that somebody may have used. Then I'm going to show you the categories that family support staff have to choose to put that under. And then maybe in the question box, if you want to just type in the category that you think it goes under, we'll see if we're all in agreement or not. So for example, yes, please type your comment in the box. If you had a family that chooses to work on debt as their goal, so their goal is they're going to work on debt because this is causing them a lot of stress in their family. What would you name that category? So here are the categories that we currently use. So if you were thinking about debt that the family was using because it's causing a lot of conflict, what category would you put it under? You guys can just go ahead and type it in the question box.
Looks like we got
Okay,
some responses. Do you want me to read them off just like right away?
Sure.
Or,
Yeah, sure,
okay.
if they come in.
All right, so Danielle had said financial debts, and Mary said financial debts as well.
So I'm assuming that we're all kind of in agreement that that might be financial debt. The reason I use that for example is because it was actually used in conflict resolution. That's where the category was. Because I can see how the thinking in the field was, well, the debt is causing them all this fighting, so that we're going to stop this conflict by lowering our debt. But if the goal is truly to lower the debt, I think we do want to see it in that category of financial debt. So let's look at this next question, though. This may be a little tricky.
I'm gonna hop in here and I'm gonna speak a little more firmly and say we absolutely want this goal to be in financial debt. And so this is one of the great things about having Joyce dig in and take a look at, what happened in ELMS and coming back to show us some of these, probably training needs around training staff to make sure that they really can think about aligning the goal that a family has made into the correct category.
So if we look at this next one, it says, a mom who's going through a divorce, she chose as her SMART goal to work on getting a job in order for her to be financially stable. She knows she cannot pay for her legal fees without getting a job. So where should this go? If you look at the category, we're going to name that category. What do you guys think? Where should that get a job go? Nobody? I stumped you all?
Estelle said earnings level, but it went to me.
Else? What do you think?
All right, Mary did employment education, and Danielle is saying thinking, ... Mary also said, and then another goal with legal. And now Danielle's ready, and she said, I would say earnings or personal/professional networks.
So I purposely put this one in here. I can tell you that in the field, they put it under legal issues. The way that I see getting a job, maybe I'm speaking outside of everything. I see it as earning levels. Like getting a job is increasing your earning level. And maybe these are discussions we need to have further as you guys are the mobility mentoring leads of what we think these categories and what these goals.
This is Karen, and I think it just points out that there needs to be some ongoing training and conversation that happens with staff as they're like, this would be a great thing for reflective supervision, right? Or it could be a great thing for a training, you know, we did it in this kind of game show way was kind of what we were hoping. And so doing something like this at a staff meeting would be or a family support staff meeting would be a really great way to just get them at least thinking about it. We want them to really increase their critical thinking skills around it at this point. And then I think that as we, you know, this is a really good one because there's so many different possibilities for it. And what we want to do is we want to work to support staff in getting it to the closest category as possible, because then that helps us better with our tracking and our data analysis that we need to complete, and ultimately probably that all of you will be completing for the staff that you support at some point as well.
Looks like
Yes,
Mary
and I
said
would only-
no earning level. Sorry.
Go
Mary
ahead,
had said
Jeff.
no earning level is what was meant, and then legal. So actually with those, I have a question with that. It looks like people are suggesting the option of sending, like putting it under one, but then also putting under the other. So how would that work within this framework?
So you would make two different goals for the family. One around attaining a job and one around their legal issue. Instead of making the job under just legal issue. And the way that Joyce explained it, that I never really thought about it, if we get really thinking about, well, did we move the meter on housing at all for our families? And we start looking at just that category, but we are miscategorizing it in that can skew our number around housing. So we would just really want to be intentional, and like Karen said, really thinking about doing this work with families, with your family support staff about which category it goes under. Okay, so did you want to say something, Karen?
Yep. So I think that it's really important to have this conversation with the staff that you're supporting when they're implementing this, to really let them know that, yes, when a parent talks about something with you and it's complex and it involves a lot of different potentially agencies or issues, that it absolutely makes sense that would be broken down into more than one goal. That you don't want to lump everything into one goal or one category just to have it be one and done kind of a thing. Instead, you really want, this I think is one of the things that potentially can help also with SMART goals, in being able to have people really think about what are the issues that the parent is facing and what are the goals that we can set that are going to help them feel like they're making some progress in having there be resolution around the needs that they're expressing.
Do we have anybody else that wanted to chime in about that or have a question?
It doesn't look like it, Carrie.
Okay. So this week on Basecamp, I'm going to hit our other two standing topics of executive function and poverty competency. I know you guys have probably seen this YouTube video. If you haven't, it is so good. And please take a few minutes to watch. It's Beth Babcock of Empath. It's called Using Brain Science to Create a New Pathway Out of Poverty. Even if you've seen it, it may have been a year or so ago or so, I think it's worth I think it's like 7 or 8 minutes long, just to sort of reground ourselves in where this mobility mentoring is coming from and what we're trying to do. I think it will inspire you. So I can see we're at the end of our time. I don't know if many of you can join us this afternoon, but Nikki will be talking about mentoring and relationships and sort of that coaching process with direct service staff. She is going to hit on a little bit on executive function with families, and then exactly what you guys had kind of asked for this morning, talking about when you're in that crisis mode, helping families get out of that into the goal setting mode. So most of this afternoon will be Nikki talking about those things. So if you all can join us, that would be great. And again, please, we are really in the middle of building out ELM. So if you have suggestions or things that you think would be really helpful, please don't hesitate to give me a shout out, call me, or email me some of your suggestions. And with that, I think we're done for the day. Okay, everybody, have a great Monday.